Last Shabbos Hagadol, a year ago, our shul was closed and our world was on lockdown. I recorded this Shabbos Hagadol Drasha last year, uploaded it to YouTube, sent out a link by email right after Shabbos. In previous years, I had shared my source sheets in advance, allowing people the opportunity to learn those sources over Shabbos or to get an idea of what I would be talking about, even if they were unable to join me Shabbat afternoon at the lecture. These electronic disseminations of shiurim, including Shabbat Hagadol Drasha, in video format, perhaps in future years as a transcript, that's here to stay. One of those COVID necessities that has long-term staying power. As we approach our second Pesach of the pandemic, we live in a world that has been scarred by COVID. Lost ways of life, lost livelihoods, and worst of all, actual lost lives. And at the same time, as we approach Pesach 5781, we approach it with a sense of gratitude. Shekimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh, as well as a sense of hope and optimism for the future. Not just the distant future, but even, Bezrat Hashem, for the near future. Over 100 million Americans have been vaccinated. Health and government officials say that if people to continue on this track, and we all continue to abide by health recommendations, then by July 4th, we may be on the way back to normal. And America's birthday may be able to be celebrated in some familiar and traditional ways. Of course, when I hear that we may be on the road to normalcy by July 4th, my mind immediately turns to September 6th, Rosh Hashanah. What will Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur this year look like? And while it's too soon to know precisely what we will be doing in 6 months from now, I can assure you that the lay and professional leadership of our shul is already mapping out the possibilities and contingencies as we seek to open up our shul in more and more ways and to more and more people. There's one aspect of this pandemic's impact that has been on my mind a lot over the last few weeks, one that I hope to come back to at the end of my drasha. But for now, let us begin to explore the laws and lessons of the Afikoman. As we all know, the Afikoman is a piece of matzah that we eat at the end of our Seder meal. Before we say Birkat Hamazon, but after the matzah ball soup and main course and dessert have been served. In the times of the Beit HaMikdash, the Korban Pesach, the Paschal sacrifice, would be eaten at this point. Meat for dessert, doesn't sound too bad. The Torah says that the Korban Pesach would be eaten along with matzah umaror. Al matzah umarorim yochluhu. To me, it sounds like a shawarma lafa, only instead of the lafa, you had soft matzah, and instead of charif, you had the maror, but lamb shawarma nonetheless. In the absence of the Korban Pesach, eating maror at the Seder has been relegated to a rabbinic commandment, because there is no Korban Pesach. However, eating matzah remains a Torah obligation. Because you see, eating matzah is mentioned independently of the Korban Pesach. Shivat Yamim Tochal Matzot, eat matzah 7 days, not necessarily connected to the Korban Pesach. And while it makes sense that we fulfill our mitzvah to eat matzah with the first kizayit of matzah that we eat before the Seder meal, during the step of motzi matzah, there are a number of rabbis who believe that the essential mitzvah of matzah on the Seder night is really fulfilled later on in the Seder, when the Korban Pesach would have been eaten, namely that last kazayit of matzah we eat, known as the Afikoman. While some rituals at our Seder tables are similar or the same to those that were performed thousands of years ago, other rituals are more recent. One case in point is the step at the Seder we call Yachatz. Our experience of Afikoman is tied to this step of Yachatz. We take the middle matzah, we break it into two, one half we use for motzi matzah and the other half for Afikoman. The half that we use for motzi matzah is what we call the lechem oni, poor man's bread. Also, lechem she'onim alav devarim harbe. It's a piece of matzah over which we say the Haggadah. When we recite the Haggadah, that piece of matzah should be on display because it is the focal point. It is the essential symbol of the Exodus story. The other piece, the larger piece that came about through Yachatz, is eaten later as the Afikoman. Now, while this is our practice, Yachatz is not mentioned in the Talmud. While they did eat matzah at the end of the meal as Afikoman, it does not seem that they had prepared that matzah necessarily all the way back at the beginning during Yachatz. The first time any Yachatz type of practice, namely breaking a matzah early on, the only time that's ever mentioned, the first time that's mentioned in our tradition, is in a piyut, a poem written specifically for Shabbat Hagadol by the 11th century French Tosafist Rav Yosef Tovela in his piyut Elohei Haruchot. We know only one of the stanzas of that poem. It's in many of our Haggadot, Chasal Sidur Pesach. That's from Rav Yosef Tovela. But that is the end of a piyut of a poem that has over 40 stanzas. That poem in its entirety, there was a tradition in some communities to read that entire piyut of 40 stanzas on Shabbat Hagadol morning in shul. I bet you're glad we don't have that custom. Contrary to our practice, where we speak very briefly on Shabbat Hagadol morning, and maybe just a short Dvar Torah, their service was particularly long on Shabbat Erev Pesach. The Paitan, the poet, tells us to break one of the matzahs. Doesn't tell us which one. And he doesn't tell us what to do with the pieces after we break that matzah. Rabbi Elazar of Worms, the great 13th century German rabbi, in his Sefer Rokeach, picks up where Rav Yosef Tovela leaves off. Sefer Rokeach explains that one piece of the matzah will be used for hamotzi, while the other piece is to be placed tachat hamapa, underneath a mappa. What's a mappa? A tablecloth, a pillow. In some way, that other piece of matzah is set aside, perhaps hidden, reserved for a later purpose. The Rokeach explains that the reason why we hide the other piece of matzah is to commemorate the fact that as the Jews left Egypt, the Torah states that they carried out with them leftovers from that very first Seder in Egypt. Pasuk in Parshat Bo, chapter 12, verse 34, Misharotam surot besimlotam al shechmam. Torah says that the Jews had their leftovers bound in their garments on their shoulders. Taking the Rokeach source text more literally, the Magen Avram quotes a practice that instead of hiding the matzah under some garment or cloth, perhaps a tablecloth or a pillow, to literally do what the Jews leaving Egypt did. They had it on their backs. Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim. And the Magen Avram suggests that that should be our practice too. We break the matzah, one half we use for motzi matzah, and the other piece we put on our backs, thereby commemorating, reenacting the Exodus from Egypt. We turn to the 16th century halachist Rav Yosef Cairo in the great Shulchan Aruch. He codifies the halacha as follows. Take the middle matzah and break it into two. One piece goes back in between the other two whole matzot and use it for motzi matzah and korech later on in the Seder. But the other piece is, quote, given to one of those as at the table to guard. Right? V'yitain chatzeh la'echad me'amasubin l'shomra la'afikoman. You give it to someone to guard at the table. Rav Sternbach, 20th century, 21st century posek in Eretz Yisrael, explains why the Afikoman requires guarding. He quotes Rav Chaim of Brisk, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik's grandfather, who cites the rush that we eat Afikoman to commemorate the Korban Pesach. As we said, both are eaten at the end of the meal. Now, one of the laws governing the Korban Pesach is that it must be guarded and attended to, like other korbanot, before it is slaughtered and even afterwards as well. Rav Sternbuch goes on to say that based on this idea from Reb Chaim of Brisk, that the Afikoman must be guarded, it is not appropriate for a child to take the Afikoman and guard it him or herself. Because after all, the guarding of a minor is not halachically significant. Now, we're all familiar with this practice, with this custom. Whether you do it at your Seder, or you read about it, or you heard about it from your friends. Who takes the Afikoman? The child. And here Reb Chaim of Rav Sternbuch suggests that there could be a halachic problem. If in fact the Afikoman needs to be guarded, and a child's guarding is not halachically significant, then perhaps this custom is in fact problematic. But before we go there, where does the custom originate of a child specifically taking the Afikoman? So far, we found where Yachatz originated. We find that the other piece that's not used for motzi matzah is put under a mappa, is put under some sort of pillowcase or tablecloth. And then we learn that somebody is supposed to guard that matzah, Shulchan Aruch says. But where does it come that a child plays a prominent role in taking the Afikoman? Interestingly enough, the earliest known allusion to this practice is not a sefer, the written word, but the illustrated picture. An illustration that is found in the 15th century Nuremberg II Haggadah. With thanks to the National Library of Israel for providing me a clear copy of that illustration, which is available on the source sheets that will be attached to this video. And in that illustration, the right-hand picture seems to be that of a child handing a broken matzah back to the father. The question is that really what's going on in that picture? Pictures are worth 1,000 words, but not unless they speak to you. What exactly is going on in that picture? Is it that a child's handing the matzah back to the father after he steals it? Or perhaps is the father taking the matzah from the child? In the 16th century halachic work Siach Yitzchak, the author writes that we should do as many unique and interesting rituals at the Seder that we can, in order to arouse the curiosity of the children, Kedei she'yishalu tinokot, so that the children will ask, they'll be inquisitive, they'll be interested, they'll be engaged. The examples he gives are that the children steal the Afikoman, and the adults grab the Afikoman back from the kids. Right? Stealing and taking back, those are some of the unique things that are meant to be done at the Seder. And the Siach Yitzchak goes on to say, and I quote, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mit'avam lazeh. God loves this back and forth that takes place between the generations, that takes place between parent and child at the Seder, the child stealing, the parent grabbing back. Let's continue to explore this custom through the ages. Later in the 17th century, Rav Yaakov Reischer of Prague, in his book Chok Yaakov, suggests that the custom of children grabbing the Afikoman developed as a way to keep the children engaged, so that they will not fall asleep, or get bored, or leave the table as the Seder progressed and the hour got late. Reischer suggested that this custom can find support in the Talmud and Psachim. And we said the Talmud doesn't specifically talk about Yachatz, but the Chok Yaakov suggests that there is an allusion to the practice of stealing the Afikoman found in the Talmud, Psachim 109a. When the Talmud quotes Rabbi Elazar, when Rabbi Elazar says, Chotvin matzot b'leilei Psachim, that literally we grab matzah on the night of the Seder. What exactly does Chotvin et hamatzot mean? So Rashi gives the explanation, one of two possibilities. Either it means to move the Seder plate at points, right? We pick up the Seder plate, we put down the Seder plate, we move it off the table, we bring it back to the table, we pick up the cup, we put down the cup, right? All these mechanics of the Seder that raise the curiosity of the child. What are we doing? This is not what we normally do at night. Right? This is not what we normally do on a Shabbat or Yom Tov. Alternatively, Rashi suggests that it means that we move the Seder along, keep things moving. We don't allow the matzah eating to drag on so that the children are awake and the adults are awake for the entire Seder. Thank God for the Rashbam, Rashi's grandson. Because after quoting his Zaidi, Rashbam then suggests, perhaps dovetailing off an opinion of his grandfather, that chotfin means we grab the matzah from the kid's hands, partially so that he shouldn't fill his belly too much. Right? You get too full, you get sleepy. You get sleepy at a late hour, you miss the rest of the Seder. But partially in order that children stay engaged and curious. In that Rashbam, he even uses the word gozlin, we steal, though it's unclear if he is referring to the child stealing the Afikoman from the parent, or the parent stealing back the Afikoman, or different matzah from the children. Perhaps to clarify this last point, the Miri explains that chotvin, the way you would describe a father-son baseball catch. Is the father throwing it to the son? Is the son throwing it to the father? No, it's back and forth. That's what chotvin means. And it's that very back and forth where you find the joy, the connection, and the love between parent and child. The Miri suggests that the purpose of the back and forth with the matzah, chotvin et hamatzot, is so that the children will similarly love the matzah, love the Seder, love the experience that they're having with their family and friends. Of course, chotvin et hamatzot, stealing the Afikoman, is not the only unusual ritual that we do Seder night in order to get an inquisitive response from the children. Lots of actions at the Seder are explained as Kadesh Yishalu Atinokot. If you're not sure why we do something at the Seder, it's a safe bet that someone says that there's no other reason other than so that the children will ask a question. One of the most unique rituals that I've heard of under this genre of in order so that children will ask questions is one quoted by the Chida in his Sefer Magal Tov. That book is a travel diary that the Chida maintained about his different travels and the people he met and the experiences he had. So in that book, the Chida recounts how one year for Seder, he was the guest at a home of a prominent Jew, Mr. Rachamim. And at one point during Mr. Rachamim's Seder, the butler picked up the matzahs and the maror and the chazeret and the karpas, the vegetables that we use at different points in the Seder, along with the matzah. And he picked it up and he waved it over the heads of all the males in the room, 3 times each, like kapara style. Well, it's not a chicken and on Rosh Hashanah, Arab Rosh Hashanah, it was the Seder items and on the Seder night. The butler then moved on to do similar with above the heads of the women and waved the Seder items once over their heads. And after doing it once, he turned to the Chida and said, do I have to do it 3 times over the women's heads like I did over the men's heads? And the Chida answered him very nicely that it was not, in fact, necessary. Never heard of that custom before. Why did he do it? No idea. Maybe just Kadesh Yishalu Atinokot, so that the children would be engaged, inquisitive, curious, and involved. Now, it's true that some rabbis in the 20th century and even before, like Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, frowned upon referring to this practice as stealing the Afikoman. After all, good Jews don't steal. You're not allowed to steal even if it's just in jest, even if you don't mean it. But many other rabbis did not see any problem with this minhag. It is told that at the Chavetz Chaim Seder, the Afikoman was stolen. I don't know who did it. Rav Chaim David Halevi, the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, beginning in 1973, wrote a tshuva responsum to a man who had Seder with his son-in-law for the first time at the grandfather's home. Right, so 3 generations, right? Grandfather, son, daughter, and her husband, son-in-law. The son-in-law at the Seder stole the Afikoman, as was the practice in his home. But that was not the minhag in the grandfather's nor in the father's home. The father-in-law afterwards was very upset and asks Rav Chaim David HaLevi, the chief rabbi, whether he can prevent his son from stealing the Afikoman, son-in-law from stealing the Afikoman at future Seders, especially since stealing is such an untoward and uncouth thing to do in the first place. So Rav Chaim David HaLevi responded that, of course, grandfather's home, grandfather's rules. But then he spent some time explaining the custom and why it is, in fact, not a problem of stealing, but in fact, a custom that can be embraced and cherished, as many of the rabbis that we've discussed explained. Well, the purpose of many unusual rituals at the Seder is so that the children will ask questions. Stealing the Afikoman has the added value of not only eliciting questions in the moment, but also of being quite memorable in retrospect. I still remember some of the Afikoman presents I received in exchange for returning that matzah many, many decades ago. I repeat the spiel at my Seder that I heard every year at my father's Seder. After breaking the middle matzah, he would turn to our annual guest, a colleague of his from the hospital, Dr. Mandel, and tell Abe that he was now responsible for guarding this Afikoman. My father would tell Abe, we need it later to finish the Seder. We can't finish the Seder without it. Abe, we're counting on you to get the job done, to guard the Afikoman and for it to be here when we get to that step of the Seder. And the subsequent plot was always the same. Children would steal the Afikoman when everyone got up to wash hands for motzi. Every year, when it was time for tzafun, Afikoman, the fathers in the room would look for their Afikoman bags, only to find them empty, and a feigned bewilderment on Abe's face when my father would reach out empty-handed. And the negotiations for Afikoman were also similar every year and yet memorable. My father's first offer was always a kiss in exchange for the Afikoman. And we would always say, although that's a nice thing, we want more. He would then say that we would be handsomely rewarded after Yom Tov if we were to give the Afikoman up now. Maybe there was an occasional gift in the moment, but usually it meant going to the toy store. Yes, before you could order everything on Amazon, sometime during Chol HaMoed Pesach. We know that the idea that the Afikoman is supposed to linger is not only an expression in our thoughts, in our memories, but also it finds expression in halacha. The Afikoman is supposed to be the last thing that we eat Seder night. Minhagim expanded upon this idea of the lingering nature of the Afikoman. There's a halacha, for instance, quoted in the Shulchan Aruch in the laws of Yom Tov, not related to Pesach, that you're not allowed to make a certain type of hole in a large piece of beef on Yom Tov, because that type of hole was used by the butchers in a commercial setting to display their meat for sale. And since you're not allowed to sell on Yom Tov, you're not allowed to make that type of notch or hole in the meat. The Magen Avraham on that halacha of Hilchot Yom Tov comments that although you may not make a hole in meat on Yom Tov, you are allowed to make a hole in a piece of the Afikoman on Pesach. Which begs the question, why would someone make a hole in the Afikoman? And the answer is to hang it, of course. There is a custom to hang a piece of the Afikoman in our homes well after the Seder all year. An actual piece of the Afikoman is meant to linger in our homes beyond the Seder into the rest of our lives. Why would you do such a thing? Here Rav Sternbach again suggests it's related to the idea that the Afikoman commemorates the Karban Pesach. Just as the Karban Pesach, as we've noted, requires guarding, it can, in reverse, be viewed as a segula for protection. Protection over our homes by hanging the Afikoman in our homes. And if segulas are not your thing, then may I suggest that hanging the Afikoman in our home could be viewed as a way of an ongoing reminder of Yetziat Mitzrayim. That God is not just the God of creation, but the God of history. That God is with us in every moment of our lives, even when we are going through oppression, like the Jews were experiencing in Egypt. They ultimately realized, they ultimately had the emunah, that God was with them all the way through. And it is this perspective that we could use not just on Pesach, commemorating that Exodus, but every moment of our lives as we navigate sometimes tumultuous waters. A few interesting halachot related to this minhag. First, Rav Reisher, in a different sefer of his, in his responsa, Shavus Yaakov, addresses whether hanging the Afikoman all year is a problem of bizui ochel. You're not allowed to disrespect food. So is it disrespectful to hang a piece of matzah in your house all year long? He answers that this cannot be a problem. First, because the custom is widespread among learned and pious Jews to do exactly that. And secondly, on technical terms, it's not a problem of disgracing the food because its purpose is a mitzvah-oriented purpose. Zecher li'yetziat Mitzrayim, which is a command, a mandate, a necessity, not just during the week of Pesach, not just during the Seder evenings, but each and every day of our lives. Another interesting halacha related to this custom of hanging the Afikoman in our homes all year is found in the responsa of Rav Yisachar Teichtel, the author of the religious Zionist favorite, Eim Habanim Smecha. And in his Tshuva Sefer, Mishnah Sachir, he deals with the following question. If the Afikoman corresponds to the Korban Pesach, and you're not allowed to leave over any morsel of the Paschal lamb until morning, lo tu'tiru mimenu ad boker, then perhaps we should not be allowed to leave over any morsel of the Afikoman. So how could it be that the custom developed to hang the Afikoman in one's home? So Rav Teichtel therefore suggests that we should, if we're hanging a piece of the Afikoman, we should use a piece of the Afikoman from the second night of Pesach, the second Seder, where there, in the diaspora at least, where there is no correspondence to the Korban Pesach. In the land of Israel, take a non-Afikoman piece of matzah from the first Seder in order to avoid this problem. Now the custom not only existed to hang a piece of matzah, Afikoman, in your home all year, but some didn't hang it. Some have this custom brought down as to keep a piece of the Afikoman with you, in your home, maybe even closer, on your body, all year long. My mother's family of German descent, Yekis, had this custom of retaining a piece of the Afikoman, keeping it all year, not hanging it in our homes, but leaving it in a dresser drawer. And Rav Chaim Vital suggests that when you travel, you take a piece of the Afikoman with you. Because if you're on a boat, says Rav Chaim Vital, and the seas begin to churn, and it looks like all may be lost at sea, there's a special segula. Take a piece of that Afikoman you took with you, throw it into the water, and the seas will calm down. By the way, it's interesting to think about how nowadays we associate Afikoman with yachatz. We break the matzah, we part the matzah. And many suggest that yachatz is related to the parting of the sea. And here Rav Chaim Vital takes it full circle and says, a piece of the matzah can be used, you throw it into the waters, and your life will be saved. Sounds pretty far out there, right? Can't be something that anyone's ever tried, right? Well, according to his diary, from his first trip to Eretz Yisrael in 1827, Sir Moses Montefiore did just this as he was traveling through the Mediterranean. He says, to describe such a storm is out of my power, and the sea was truly running mountains high. This is from the diary of Sir Moses Montefiore. I threw into the sea a piece of my Passover cake, at the same time praying to God to preserve us, as he had in old times preserved our forefathers for the turbulence of the sea. And in his great mercy, says Sir Moses Montefiore, to grant us a fair wind sufficient for our purpose. The story goes that the Montefiores were saved, And every year thereafter on Pesach, his subsequent generations would recall this miracle and read from his diary at the Pesach Seder. Many of those who keep a piece of the Afikoman all year will discard it Erev Pesach when they burn their chametz of the following year. And this makes sense in light of what we learned from Rav Sternbach, that if the Afikoman corresponds to the Karban Pesach, and you ended up leaving over a piece of the Karban Pesach, you have to burn it. So too if you leave over a piece of the Afikoman beyond the Seder night, even for a good purpose, even as a segula, even as a zeicher l'tziat Mitzrayim, when you take it down the next year, you're going to in fact have to burn it as well. Now besides this topic of the Afikoman, of stealing the Afikoman, of grabbing the Afikoman, of engaging in this back and forth, of hanging up the Afikoman, of Afikoman as a segula for Shmira, all of these things were interesting to research and fun to present. But I specifically wanted to talk about the Afikoman this year because of the target audience of this minhag, which is the children. This COVID pandemic has impacted all of us, but none as profoundly and pervasively as it has impacted children. Children were the least likely to have their physical health impacted by COVID, and yet they are the demographic who have been most impacted in so many other ways: academically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. Even as we have opened up our shuls in so many ways, our youth offerings are lagging far behind. Though many adults have come back to shul, many children, most children, and most parents with young children have not yet. This may be what current circumstances allow and require, but as we look to the Seder, let us acknowledge the impact that COVID has and will continue to have on children. There's many articles being written now about Generation C, the generation of children, especially preteens and early teens, who have lived through this COVID pandemic, the impact of which will continue to be monitored and probably noted for years, if not decades, ahead. Let us utilize our Seder this year to focus on this real challenge. Let us resolve to make children, the next generation, our future, whether they are our biological children and grandchildren, whether they are our community's children here in Hollywood, whether they are Jewish children around the world. Let us use this moment and this year's Pesach Seder to make them a priority. Children as a priority that capture our attention and lingers, just like the Afikoman. Chag Kosher V'Sameach.